So I'm asking you to speak up as much as you can so that it gets recorded, because sometimes the transcribers, they have a really hard time hearing the question. And I can't really sit here and turn the microphone all the time when I'm taking answers from the masters, so I have to go with it. So, first question?
Can masters comment about genetically modified food? Is it really black and white, bad or good, or is there some gray?
Okay, genetically modified foods. Mother Mary? Well, my beloved, there is, of course, nothing that is entirely black and white on earth, as you are beginning to realize. So, you need to recognize here that we are facing a very delicate problem on earth. Our goal is, of course, to raise the consciousness, to manifest the golden age, to get the fallen beings off the planet, and many other goals like this. But the gap between the highest goal that Saint Germain envisions for his golden age and where the planet is at right now is actually very large, in the sense that Saint Germain has a vision that requires such great leaps in consciousness that most people would barely be able to fathom it right now. So we have to work with the level of consciousness that most people have right now. And this means that in some cases, we are actually using and even releasing certain ideas that are by no means the highest possible. But they can form an intermediary step that can help the planet move forward in some way. So you need to recognize that there are times where we face a very delicate challenge. Should we release a certain idea that can give rise to a new form of technology, knowing full well how the fallen beings might abuse that technology, but still seeing that it can serve some positive purpose? The ultimate challenge that we faced in this regard was the release of the ideas that led to the creation of the atom bomb. Naturally, we could see immediately how there was the potential for a planetary nuclear war that could essentially destroy the entire planet. We also saw that humankind was in a cycle, and there was actually a very profound reason for that, which we have not yet exposed, but will expose in the future, where wars could become more and more destructive with conventional weapons. And that the only thing that could realistically stop this process was the release of a weapon that was so terrible in its consequences that even the most war-hungry people would be forced to think twice about using it. And so you see that there are many other technologies where we face a similar dilemma. Ideally, in the golden age, there are certain changes that will be brought about through consciousness alone. But as an intermediary step, because we cannot bring humanity up to that level quickly, we sometimes have to release a technological solution that brings people or the planet forward. And so you actually see that Saint Germain has been doing this since he ascended, where he saw, for example, that most people spent so much of their time and attention on making a living that they did not have time and attention left over to pursue the spiritual path. And so he saw that the only realistic way to change the equation was to release technology that could empower people to produce what they need to sustain the physical body without so much labor. And that is why he has released a number of technologies that allow people to produce more food, for example, and other things with less human labor involved. And we are facing other dilemmas like this, where we sometimes have to take certain measures. And you see, for example, that one of the issues we are facing is that naturally we know that the planet is designed to sustain 10 billion life streams. And in the golden age, there will be 10 billion life streams on the planet. You actually see that there are some scientists and futurists who have already started to talk about the fact that population growth will not continue indefinitely, but that there will come a point where population growth slows and the planetary population stabilizes. And some of them have even predicted that it will be around 10 billion people. But we have seen for many, many years that one of the only ways to overthrow the control that the fallen beings have over Earth is actually to increase the population. We have said it before that if you go back to the Middle Ages and look at the feudal societies where you had a basically agricultural economy, there was only a certain amount of people that could be sustained by what such a society could produce, by the amount of food that could be produced. And so, when certain technologies and knowledge was released that decreased infant mortality and certain diseases and increased the the lifespan, then you saw that the population started growing, and there simply came a point where the feudal societies could not be maintained because they could not feed the people that were alive, and when people are faced with starvation and death, they are willing to take a step to overthrow the political order that otherwise they didn't think they could overthrow, or that they shouldn't overthrow because it was the way things were meant to be and it gave them a sense of stability. And so you see that population growth is still today a very important factor in challenging the status quo, not only in certain nations, but even on a planetary level. We have said before that basically the rich nations of the world are now living like the feudal lords, and there are large parts of the world that are like the peasants, but they are becoming so numerous now that they cannot sustain their life, and this means that there needs to be an overthrow of the planetary order where the rich nations begin to share much more and there's more wealth created in the poor nations. So naturally, when the population increases, we see that what do you do to produce enough food to sustain the population? And you see, because of the lower state of consciousness that the planet has, that there are certain diseases that attack certain plants. And therefore it was decided that we would actually release the technology whereby scientists could begin to genetically modify certain plant species to allow them to produce more. So that more food could be produced, certain diseases could be counteracted at your genetic level instead of you having to spray them with chemicals that also go into the food and go into the body and so forth and so on. And so what I'm saying is that genetically modified foods are by no means an ideal solution. It is not a long-term solution. And of course that anytime scientists, especially those who have a materialistic approach, start messing with the genetic code, there is always a potential that something can go wrong by accident, or that they can deliberately try to do something that will allow the fallen beings to have control, or even allow them to create some kind of condition that now decreases the population, and therefore they think they can get back to a state where they have more control. So yes, genetic modification, both in terms of foods, but also in the human body, can of course be abused. You saw, for example, in the 1990s, the entire effort to map the human genome. And this was driven by the fact that there were people who thought that it would be possible to identify a gene that created a certain disease, and then it would be possible to come up with some kind of medical technology or medicaments that would modify those genes and therefore eradicate the disease. But what drove this was that there were companies that seriously thought that they could take out a patent on some of this and therefore gain a monopoly on curing certain types of diseases, and they could make inordinate amounts of money. There were also those who had even more negative intentions and were hoping that it would allow them to modify the human genes, for example, so that the production of children would be decreased with a certain factor so that the population would stop growing because fertility would be lowered through genetic modification. And some, of course, still think so and are attempting to do this. But the bottom line here, in terms of genetically modified foods, is this. There are many people, the majority of the people on earth, who are at such a low level of consciousness that the most important thing for them is the survival of the physical body so that they have an opportunity to be in embodiment. And for these people, genetically modified foods basically do not have a decisive influence, neither on their physical bodies nor on their life in general. The influence of this is insignificant in the overall scheme of things. But it is significant that they have food to eat. And so it is better for them to eat genetically modified foods than to either die from starvation or be malnurtured and therefore have a lesser life opportunity because they are constantly undernourished. Then there are people who have a higher level of consciousness, such as the top 10% and the spiritual people. And again, the influence on you is insignificant because, as you know, and as we have told, you are not defined by your genes. Your bodies are influenced by your genes, but your spiritual growth is not when you reach beyond the 48th level of consciousness. You actually, even when you rise above the 48th level of consciousness, you actually start transcending the influence of the physical body. And as you walk through the course of self-mastery and walk towards the 96th level, you come to the point where you have less and less influence from the physical body on your spiritual growth. The body does not hold back your spiritual growth. And so, again, you may look at life, you may look at people, and you may look that you have certain diseases or certain tendencies that you carry with you, and you can say, as the popular saying goes, oh, this is in my genes. But as we have told you, the physical body is a product of the three higher bodies. So a disease is not in your genes exclusively. It's also in your three higher bodies. So you may be born into a family that has a long history of having a certain disease that goes from generation to generation. But you're not having the disease because you were born into that family. You were born into that family because you already had the consciousness of the disease in your three higher bodies. And that is why you were magnetized to that situation, in most cases because you wanted to force yourself to confront that consciousness and overcome that consciousness. So we could say that the reason we have not given much teaching on genetically modified foods is that we don't consider it one of the major hindrances that we want you to make calls on. Obviously, there are changes that will happen in the field. Obviously, there will come a point where you do not need to physically modify the foods, because as the consciousness is raised, the genes of both plant species and the human bodies will change. The real way to change the genes is to change the consciousness. And this will happen as we move further into the golden age. But as an intermediary step, we evaluated that it was necessary to release the knowledge and the technology to physically modify genes, because it could have a short-term effect that had a more positive effect on the survivability of the people in poor nations than the negative effects. So the positive outweighed the negative, and therefore we released the technology. It is clear that there will come a point in the golden age where it will not be necessary to modify genes physically. But this will require a substantial raising of the consciousness that will take decades to achieve. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, last month I got spammed with the number 44. Everywhere I look, see 44, 44, 44. So why is this? What is this process behind this thing?
Okay, Mother Mary. My beloved, you have many spiritual people who start seeing certain numbers. And you have many people who get very fascinated by this, and some even turn it into almost a religion. And they want to know why this is happening. They want to think that this has some major significance. When you see a certain number, it is in most cases because the human brain and the human mind is programmed to recognize patterns. You are, if you think about this, always looking for patterns. In fact, much of perception is looking for patterns. That is why we have given you these teachings, that you have a perception filter in your three higher bodies, and that you are projecting, you are creating an image based on the filter, and you are projecting that image out upon the world outside of you and even upon yourself. And so, once you have these projection filters created, your brain, your mind will look for patterns that fit into the filter and that validate the filter. And so, truly, while it can be amusing, entertaining that you see these numbers, it has no decisive significance that you need to be concerned about. It is simply that your brain is in a phase where it is focused on a particular number, and therefore you start seeing it more. It is not necessarily that the number suddenly occurs more often, but it is simply that your mind recognizes it and sees it more often. So you could use it in a positive way to consider, what perception filter do I have? But there are also many of the people out there who become completely fascinated by this, who could benefit from thinking, well, why do I have this desire to feel special, and why do I think that there are outer signs that make me feel special, or that I need outer signs in order to feel special? You will see, my beloved, that there is a certain level of the spiritual path, and I'm especially talking about the many people out there who are looking for outer phenomena, where people are looking for some outer confirmation of why they're special. So they go into numerology, astrology, they go to psychics, They look at this, that, or the next thing, and they try to find some physical sign, some physical manifestation that is different for them than for most people, and then they try to read some kind of meaning into it and find out why it makes you special that you have this particular configuration in your astrology, or that you were born on this particular date where when you add up the numbers it comes to this and it has this significance. And I'm not saying that this can't help people in a certain way, but it is not something that brings you to the levels of Christhood, and it is not something that you need to spend a lot of attention on, because it can become a blind alley that actually takes you away from the real path. So at the level of consciousness that you are all at, given that you recognize Ascended Master teachings, you just look at it as an interesting coincidence, you shrug your shoulders, and then you move on. Yeah.
The Ascended Masters, they do treat us very nicely, but the universe sometimes, or a lot of times, seems to treat us, doesn't seem to treat us very nicely, and it becomes, a lot of times it becomes more our torture, and it brings us face to face with our worst nightmares. And I think that we don't seem to know enough about how the universe works, or how the cosmic mirror works, and my question is, like, if we have been in embodiment for such a long time, for so many lifetimes, why is it still that we're getting results in our life that are not what we want, that we're getting feedback from the cosmic mirror or the universe that is not really what we intended. It's oftentimes the opposite of that. So, but the Masters maybe enlighten us a bit more on how the universe works.
Okay. Want to marry again? This is a very understandable question that virtually all people have at some point on their path. And the major reason for this is that you need to recognize, as we have said before, what kind of planet you are living on. That the collective consciousness is very low, that there are many people who are below the 48th level of consciousness, and that there is a very drastic inference from the fallen beings. What often trips up spiritual people is that they have an inner intuitive sense or memory of how things are in the higher realms, or on a planet with a higher level of collective consciousness. So you have an expectation that things on earth should be better, that certain things should not happen. This is natural, this is understandable. But if you look at the teachings we have given about the fallen beings and the state of the earth, it is not a realistic expectation, and it is not a constructive expectation, because the earth is by no means an ideal planet. There are many religions on the earth that want to portray it that this is the only planet created by God, and therefore, since God can't make a mistake, there must be some explanation for why things are the way they are. And that means that the earth probably is ideal in some way. There's just some explanation we don't have. But the reality is that the earth is by no means an ideal planet. It is one of the lowest planets in the sphere in which you live. And so when you notice, when you recognize that, you see that you are one individual, and you can raise your consciousness. But there is a limit to how much, even with a raised consciousness, that you can take control over your outer situations and avoid certain unpleasant events And the reason for this is that you are living on a planet with so many other people that have a much lower consciousness. And they are creating all kinds of karmic circumstances, all kinds of conflicts. They have lowered the density of the physical bodies so that diseases manifest. And so you have all of these conditions where it is not possible for one person to always take control over your outer circumstances. It can be your own karma from past lives, but it can also simply be that you are living among a group of people, be it your family, be it your nation, be it humanity at large, that has such a low state of consciousness that just by the fact that you are in physical embodiment and you are living here, you will be affected by some of these conditions that have been collectively created. So you will notice, if you look carefully at what we have told you, is that the essence of Christhood and Buddhahood is not to take command over your outer situation, but to take command over your inner situation and your reaction to external circumstances. So you do not allow the external circumstances to stop your progress on the path, and to stop you from feeling inner peace, to stop you from feeling good about yourselves. So, to return to the question, it is constructive to recognize that not everything that happens to you is a message from the universe or a reflection back from the cosmic mirror. This may seem to contradict what we have said before, including what I have said before. But there is a point on the path where you need to basically look at everything as a message from the universe, because you need to look at what is it in my consciousness that attracted this situation to me. Because there is a point of the past where you can say that basically everything that happens to you is because you have attracted that situation with your state of consciousness. So the reason why you were born in a certain country, in a certain family, is because there was something in your consciousness. And that is why you experience these outer conditions. But there does come a point when you go higher on the path and you have started overcoming some of these limitations in your consciousness, where you may still experience a physical situation that has unpleasant consequences. But you can begin to recognize that you have transcended this in your own consciousness. But the people around you, the people in the group that you are actually here to uplift, they have not. And therefore they have collectively produced a circumstance. But because you are part of the group, you are living in that situation, you are affected by it also. And so there comes that point when you go higher on the path where you begin to have this inner sense where sometimes you pay attention and you say, what is it in me that attracted this situation? And other times you ignore an outer situation because you realize it doesn't have a message from the universe. Or rather, maybe the message is to simply ignore it or make the best of it and move on with your spiritual path. There actually comes that point on the path where you are not so focused on outer circumstances, but you are more focused on your reaction. And so, if you feel that you are reacting to a certain circumstance, then you look at, why do I react? But there also comes a point where you can experience a circumstance, it may be unpleasant, but you don't even react to it. You just do whatever you have to do to minimize the consequences, and then you move on. You simply ignore it if you can, or you turn it into a positive, and you simply shift your focus and focus on something else that is more important to your progress on the path. Somebody had a question over there? Yeah?
Maybe we can close there.
appearance in this so-called alternative medicine, and there is appearing some trend like energy medicine. And the specific question would be, because there are some devices already on the market, like for bioresonance, that works like taking some measures on the body and detecting some inharmonious vibrations, and they return to the body to make it more harmonious. My question would be if this is the right direction and how mature or immature these methods are in the current state.
Okay. Mother Mary? As I said in my answer about the foods, we are basically in a situation on earth where the ideal is that people would be able to heal all diseases through consciousness. And so the highest potential of energy medicine is that there are certain people who have reached the state of maturity, spiritual maturity, and have educated themselves and trained themselves, where they have the ability to channel energy from their higher presence and from the ascended masters to a certain person and heal that person directly through the powers of the mind. This would also require, of course, that the people had some understanding of the consciousness behind the disease